Approaching a furious, leather-clad Hell's Angel stranded in the dead of night was a sheer death wish for a 17-year-old living out of a dumpster. He did it anyway. He had watched from the shadows as the howling desert wind was interrupted by the violent sputtering and dying of the massive motorcycle, and he made the reckless choice to step forward. The neon sign of Rusty's Diner and Truck Stop flickered a sickly red against the pitch-black Arizona sky. It was 2 a.m. and the temperature had plummeted, turning the desert air into a biting, abrasive force. Tucked behind a rusted-out commercial dumpster, 17-year-old Caleb shivered beneath a thin, moth-eaten moving blanket. Caleb had been a ghost for 3 years. After fleeing a violently abusive foster home in Nevada, he had learned the hard way that visibility was dangerous. You stayed out of sight, you scrounged for scraps, and you kept your head down. His only prized possessions were a worn canvas tool roll that had belonged to his late grandfather, a master mechanic, and the encyclopedic knowledge of engines his grandfather had drilled into his head before passing away. That night, the silence of the desolate highway was shattered by the agonizing sound of a massive V-twin engine misfiring, backfiring like a shotgun blast, and finally grinding to a violent halt right in the middle of the diner's cracked asphalt parking lot. Caleb peered out from behind the dumpster. Illuminated by the flickering neon was a colossal man, easily 6'4" and built like a concrete bunker. He was draped in heavy leather, and on his back, the unmistakable, terrifying death's head logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club gleamed under the street lamp. Below the skull was the California bottom rocker, the man Arthur Grizzly Hayes, though Caleb didn't know his name yet, kicked his massive steel-toed boot against the front tire of his customized 1998 Harley-Davidson Road Glide. He unleashed a string of curses that cut through the cold air. Grizzly pulled a heavy maglite from his saddlebag, holding it in his teeth as he frantically ripped off the side covers of the bike, desperately searching for the problem. Caleb watched the biker's panicked urgency. A Hell's Angel wasn't just annoyed, this man looked desperate. He kept checking his watch, staring down the dark, empty stretch of Interstate 40. Every survival instinct screamed at Caleb to stay hidden. You don't approach a furious outlaw biker in the middle of nowhere. But as Caleb watched Grizzly burning his hands on the hot exhaust, fruitlessly checking the spark plug wires, Caleb recognized the scent riding on the wind. It wasn't just unburned fuel, it was the distinct, acrid smell of burning electrical resin. Before his brain could stop his legs, Caleb crawled out from his hiding spot, clutching his canvas tool roll. Grizzly whipped around at the sound of gravel crunching, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his belt. "Back off, stray," Grizzly growled, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Unless you want to be a permanent fixture in the pavement, you turn around and walk away." Caleb froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling but clear. "You got a dead short, mister. It's not your plugs. Your voltage regulator plug melted against the exhaust shield. You're grounded out." Grizzly narrowed his eyes, shining the blinding beam of the flashlight directly into Caleb's grimy, bruised face. He saw a starving kid, practically skin and bones, wearing a jacket 3 sizes too large. Grizzly scoffed. "And what the hell does a dumpster rat know about an evolution engine? I know that if you keep trying to crank it, you're going to fry your stator entirely, and then you'll be pushing this 900-pound bike all the way to Kingman," Caleb replied, holding his ground despite the sheer terror gripping him. "Let me look." Grizzly hesitated. He checked his watch again. 2:15 a.m. A heavy sigh escaped the giant man's chest. He stepped back, gesturing to the bike with the flashlight. "You got 5 minutes, kid. If you mess with my ride and make it worse, I'm throwing you over the diner's roof." Caleb didn't waste a second. He dropped the asphalt, ignoring the sharp rocks cutting into his knees. He slid under the hot engine, pulling a pair of needle-nose pliers and a roll of high-heat electrical tape from his grandfather's kit. Just as he suspected, the primary wire harness had slipped from its bracket, resting directly against the blistering exhaust pipe. The insulation had melted away, fusing the copper wires to the metal and completely shorting out the electrical system. "Hold the light here," Caleb instructed, momentarily forgetting who he was talking to. To his credit, the giant biker knelt beside him, aiming the beam perfectly. Caleb's hands, though shaking from the cold, moved with practiced precision. He used a rusted blade to cut away the melted, ruined plastic connector. He stripped the wires bare using his thumbnail and pliers, taking a scrap of heavy gauge copper wire he had scavenged weeks ago from an abandoned construction site. Caleb bridged the gap, twisting the wires tightly before wrapping them in thick, overlapping layers of electrical tape. Finally, he used a heavy zip tie from his roll to secure the harness high up on the frame, inches away from the heat of the exhaust. "Try it now," Caleb said, sliding out from under the bike, wiping grease across his forehead. Grizzly looked skeptical. He swung his massive leg over the saddle, turned the ignition switch, and hit the starter. The Harley roared to life instantly, settling into a deep, thunderous idle. The headlight blazed bright, no longer dimming from the short circuit. Grizzly killed the engine, sitting in stunned silence. He looked at the dashboard clock, then down at the scrawny teenager standing in the cold. The biker reached into his leather vest, pulling out a thick money clip secured with a silver skull. He peeled off 3 crisp $100 bills and held them out. "You know your way around a wrench, kid. Go buy yourself a steak and a warm bed." Caleb stared at the money. $300 was a fortune. It was months of food. It was a bus ticket to anywhere. But he looked at the Harley, running his grease-stained hand gently over the chrome air cleaner. "Keep it," Caleb said softly, stepping back. Grizzly's heavy brow furrowed in confusion. "Excuse me, my granddad taught me to wrench. He rode a 48 Panhead. He always told me that the road provides for those who provide for the road," Caleb said, his voice quiet. "I don't want your money, mister. Just getting to touch a real engine again. That's payment enough for me. Safe travels." Without waiting for a reply, Caleb picked up his tool roll, turned his back on the intimidating biker, and walked back toward the shadows of the dumpster. Grizzly sat frozen on his bike. In his world, a world of violence, extortion, and rigid club rules, nobody did anything for free. An unpayable debt was a dangerous thing, but a freely given gift from a kid who had absolutely nothing? That defied everything the Hells Angels understood about the streets. "What's your name, kid?" Grizzly's booming voice called out across the lot. "Caleb," he replied from the darkness. Grizzly stared at the dumpster for a long, calculating moment. He didn't say thank you outlaw bikers rarely did. He just fired up the Harley, kicked it into gear, and tore out onto the highway, the roar of his exhaust echoing into the night. The next morning, the brutal reality of Caleb's existence came crashing back. At 7 a.m., Caleb was jolted awake by a vicious kick to his ribs. He gasped, scrambling backward as the harsh morning sun blinded him. Standing over him was Rusty, the belligerent owner of the diner, clutching a heavy aluminum baseball bat. Beside Rusty stood Deputy Miller, a notoriously corrupt local sheriff's deputy who took pleasure in terrorizing the transients who passed through the county. "I told you to clear out of here a week ago, you little rat," Rusty spat, kicking Caleb's moving blanket away. "Please, I wasn't hurting anything." Unleaving, Caleb choked out, clutching his bruised side. He reached for his grandfather's tool roll. Before he could grab it, Deputy Miller stepped on Caleb's hand, grinding his heavy uniform boot into the boy's fingers. Caleb screamed in pain. "You ain't taking stolen property with you," Miller sneered, bending down to snatch the canvas tool roll. He tossed it to Rusty. "Throw this junk in the incinerator out back. And you, vagrant, are going to the county lockup for trespassing and loitering. No, please, those are my grandfather's. They're all I have, Caleb pleaded, tears of pain and desperation streaming down his dirt-streaked face. He lunged for the tools, but Miller violently shoved him back, sending Caleb crashing hard into the side of the rusted dumpster. Blood began to trickle from a cut above Caleb's eye. Rusty laughed, turning toward the back of the diner with the tool roll. Should have learned to pay rent. Trash. Caleb sat in the dirt, defeated. The hunger, the cold, the sheer hopelessness crushed him. He closed his eyes, waiting for the deputy to haul him up and throw him into the back of a cruiser. But then, the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, distant hum, like an approaching earthquake. The stagnant morning air grew thick. Deputy Miller paused, his hand hovering over his handcuffs, looking toward the highway. Over the crest of Interstate 40, a tidal wave of chrome, black leather, and roaring engines crested the horizon. It wasn't 10 bikes. It wasn't 50. It was over 300 Hells Angels. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, two abreast, taking over both lanes of the highway. The noise was apocalyptic as synchronized, thundering roar that rattled the windows of Rusty's diner and shook the loose gravel in the parking lot. The procession seemed endless. Deck's head patches flashed in the morning sun, representing charters from California, Nevada, Arizona, and beyond. Rusty froze in his tracks, dropping the tool roll. Deputy Miller's face drained of all color. Outlaw motorcycle clubs occasionally passed through, but never a coordinated pack of this magnitude. This wasn't a ride. This was an army on the move. The lead bike suddenly hit their turn signals. To Rusty and Miller's absolute horror, the entire armada began turning into the diner's parking lot. They fled at the space surrounding the building, parking 3 deep, blocking the exits, blocking the highway off-ramps. The heat radiating from hundreds of massive V-twin engines turned the air into a shimmering mirage. For a terrifying 30 seconds, all 300 engines revved simultaneously in a deafening display of power before cutting off in perfect unison. The sudden ringing silence that followed was more intimidating than the noise. 300 heavy combat boots hit the asphalt. 300 men, covered in tattoos and wearing the terrifying 3-piece patches of the world's most notorious motorcycle club, stood motionless. The crowd parted down the middle. Walking through the sea of leather was Arthur Grizzly Hayes. In the daylight, he looked even more massive, his eyes hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses. Flanking him was a man with cold, calculating eyes and a president patch, Iron Bill Dawson alongside a dozen heavily armed enforcers. Grizzly walked straight past a trembling Deputy Miller, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped in front of Caleb, who was still slumped against the dumpster, bleeding from his eyebrow. Grizzly reached down, wrapping his massive, calloused hand around Caleb's forearm and hauled the boy to his feet with surprising gentleness. Grizzly turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Deputy Miller. The sheer menace radiating from the biker made the cop take an involuntary step backward, his hand nervously brushing his sidearm, a fatally foolish move. Instantly, 50 bikers stepped forward, their hands dropping to heavy chains, buck knives, and concealed waistbands. "President Dawson," Grizzly said, his voice booming across the silent, packed lot. "This here is Caleb, Iron Bill Dawson, a man whose reputation in the criminal underworld was legendary, stepped forward. He looked Caleb up and down, taking in the bruised face and the blood. "This the boy?" Dawson asked, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "This is the boy," Grizzly confirmed. He turned back to the crowd. "Last night my ride died. I was stranded. I was carrying the ashes of my old lady, Sarah, trying to make it to the sacred sunrise scattering at the Mojave Charter. If I had missed that sunrise, I would have dishonored her memory, and I would have dishonored this club." A low murmur of solemn agreement rippled through the 300 men. "This kid," Grizzly pointed a massive finger at Caleb, crawled out of a dumpster in the freezing cold. He didn't ask for a dime. He refused my money. He fixed my bike with scrap wire and bare hands, and he got me there with 10 minutes to spare. Grizzly's gaze snapped back to Deputy Miller and Rusty. And now I ride back to find this badge-wearing coward and this grease-trap owner beating on the boy who saved my family's honor. Rusty whimpered, quite literally wetting his pants as he backed against the diner's brick wall. Deputy Miller swallowed hard, his voice cracking. Now listen here. He's just a local vagrant. He was trespassing. Before Miller could finish his sentence, Grizzly moved with a terrifying speed for a man his size. He grabbed the deputy by the front of his Kevlar vest, lifting the man inches off the ground. He ain't a vagrant, Grizzly snarled, his face inches from the terrified cop. He's under the protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, which means from this second forward he is our blood. You touch him again, you look at him wrong, you breathe his air without his permission, and we won't just burn down the diner. We will dismantle your entire miserable life. Grizzly dropped the cop in a heap. He walked over to where Rusty had dropped the canvas tool roll. He picked it up, dusting the dirt off the old canvas, and walked back to Caleb, placing it reverently in the boy's hands. You said the road provides for those who provide for the road, Grizzly said, pulling off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were fierce but profoundly respectful. You provided for us, Caleb. Now it's our turn. The procession did not leave Caleb behind. While the roaring armada of Harley-Davidsons secured the perimeter, a heavy black Ford F-350 chase truck with an enclosed trailer pulled up to the diner. Grizzly personally escorted Caleb, who was still clutching his grandfather's tool roll as if it were a life raft, into the passenger seat. As the truck pulled onto Interstate 40, flanked by 300 outlaws acting as a presidential motorcade, Caleb watched Rusty's diner fade into the rearview mirror. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight of survival lifted off his chest, replaced by a terrifying, profound unknown. They rode for hours, crossing the state line into California, the desert giving way to the sprawling, sun-baked concrete of San Bernardino. The convoy eventually split, but a core group of 50 riders, including Grizzly and President Iron Bill Dawson, escorted the truck to a massive, nondescript industrial complex surrounded by 12-foot razor wire fences. Above the reinforced steel doors hung a rusted metal sign, Ironclad Customs. Inside, it was a cathedral of chrome, exhaust fumes, and heavy metal music. Sparks showered from welding bays, and the skeletal frames of custom choppers lined the polished concrete floor. This was a legitimate business owned by the club, a sanctuary where patched members and trusted affiliates built some of the most expensive, highly sought-after motorcycles on the West Coast. Grizzly introduced Caleb to Big Joe Abernathy, a heavily bearded, towering mechanic who ran the shop. Big Joe didn't ask about Caleb's past. He just looked at the boy's calloused, grease-stained hands and pointed to a push broom. You sleep in the loft above the paint booth, Big Joe grunted, handing Caleb a clean shop rag. You eat what we eat. You sweep the floors, you clean the parts washer, and you keep your mouth shut. If you prove you know which end of a wrench is which, maybe I'll let you touch a real machine for the next 6 months. Caleb's life transformed. The terrified, starving boy from the dumpster vanished, replaced by a young man who ate 3 square meals a day and packed muscle onto his previously skeletal frame. The bikers, intimidating and rough around the edges, treated him with a gruff, unspoken respect. He was Grizzly's stray, and under the club's unwritten laws, he was completely untouchable. But Caleb didn't just sweep floors. His genius, meticulously cultivated by his late grandfather, quickly became impossible to ignore. Big Joe would intentionally leave complex mechanical problems unsolved at night: a misaligned transmission, a hopelessly flooded carburetor, only to find them perfectly tuned and reassembled by Caleb the next morning. By winter, Caleb was no longer the shop boy. At 17, he was Ironclad's lead engine builder. Grizzly, who treated the boy like a surrogate son, bought him a stripped-down 1990 Sportster frame for his birthday, telling Caleb that if he could build it from the ground up, it was his to keep. Caleb finally felt safe. He had a family, a purpose, and a home. But the past is a relentless hunter, and Caleb's was about to kick down the door. 3 states away, in a filthy trailer park in Nevada, Silas Croft was staring at a cracked smartphone screen. Silas was Caleb's former foster father, a cruel, manipulative drunk who had used the foster system to line his own pockets. When Caleb had run away, Silas had lost his monthly state stipend. But worse than that, Silas knew a secret Caleb didn't. Caleb's grandfather had left a modest life insurance policy and a trust fund tied to the sale of his old house. It wasn't millions, but it was nearly $60,000, legally set to transfer to Caleb on his 18th birthday, which was now only 3 weeks away. As his legal guardian on paper, Silas needed Caleb back under his roof to force the boy to sign over power of attorney. Silas had spent months searching dead ends until a blurry photo surfaced on a trucker's Facebook group. The post was about a massive biker standoff at Rusty's Diner in Arizona. In the background of the photo, standing next to a giant biker, was a scrawny kid clutching a familiar canvas tool roll. Silas smiled, revealing rotting teeth. He picked up the phone and called a sleazy, unlicensed bounty hunter named Trent. "I found my runaway payday," Silas hissed. "And he's holed up with a bunch of grease monkeys in California." The rhythmic hum of a polished grinding wheel filled Ironclad Customs, a sound that had become Caleb's lullaby. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. Most of the club was out on a regional run to Fresno, leaving only Caleb and Big Joe in the cavernous garage. Caleb was elbow-deep in the engine block of his 1990 Sportster, meticulously adjusting the pushrods. He wiped a streak of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand, feeling a rare, profound sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he was safe. Then, the heavy corrugated steel doors rattled violently on their tracks, shrieking open. Caleb looked up. His breath caught in his throat, and the heavy crescent wrench slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete. Standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding California sun, was Silas Croft. Silas was the nightmare Caleb thought he had outrun his former, violently abusive foster father from Nevada. Flanking Silas was a wide-shouldered, dead-eyed man wearing a tactical Vesta skip tracer named Trent. Silas clutched a thick manila folder, a predatory rot-toothed grin spreading across his face. "Well, ain't this a cozy little chop shop?" Silas sneered, stepping onto the polished floor. "Look at you, boy, playing grease monkey with the big bad bikers. Pack your trash. We're going back to Nevada." Panic, raw and paralyzing, seized Caleb's chest. He stumbled backward, knocking over his red shop towel and scattering his grandfather's vintage tools across the floor. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Caleb stammered, his voice trembling. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't have a choice, brat. You're 17. You're my legal ward for 3 more weeks." Silas knew what Caleb didn't. Caleb's grandfather had left a $60,000 trust fund set to unlock on his 18th birthday. Silas needed Caleb's signature before the boy aged out of the system, and he was willing to drag him back by the hair to get it. Big Joe stepped out from the welding bay, his massive frame casting a long shadow. He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing. "Shops closed to the public. Turn around before you need a wheelchair to leave." Trent, the bounty hunter, immediately rested his hand on the butt of a holstered Glock. "I have court orders, pal. Interfere with illegal extraction, and I'll have the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department raid this warehouse in 10 minutes. Back off." Silas lunged forward, grabbing Caleb roughly by the collar of his denim shirt. Caleb thrashed, kicking wildly, screaming for him to let go. Before Trent could draw his weapon to keep Big Joe at bay, the thunderous roar of straight pipe exhaust shattered the tension. The ground literally shook. Grizzly, President Iron Bill Dawson, and 8 fully patched enforcers roared directly into the shop, cutting off the exits. They killed their engines in perfect, menacing unison. Grizzly saw Silas' hands on Caleb. A primal, terrifying rage transformed the giant biker. He crossed the floor in 3 massive strides and backhanded Silas with the force of a freight train. Silas flew backward, crashing hard into a stack of tires. Trent panicked and drew his Glock, but before he could level it, the deafening clack-clack of 3 pump-action shotguns echoed through the shop. The enforcers had him dead to rights. Trent dropped his gun, throwing his hands into the air, instantly realizing he was entirely out of his depth. Iron Bill Dawson calmly dismounted his customized chopper. The president walked over to the commotion, his heavy boots crunching on the floor. He ignored Silas, who was groaning and spitting blood. Instead, Iron Bill's cold eyes locked onto the vintage tools scattered on the floor. With a slow, deliberate movement, Iron Bill knelt. He picked up the heavy crescent wrench Caleb had dropped. The metal was old, but immaculately maintained. Iron Bill pulled a rag from his leather vest and wiped away a smear of grease, revealing a distinct, hand-stamped engraving, a winged piston overlapping the initials DH. The color drained from the hardened president's face. He looked up, locking eyes with Caleb. "Kid," Iron Bill said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that commanded total silence. "What was your grandfather's full name?" "Henderson, sir." Caleb swallowed hard. "David Henderson." Everyone called him Dutch. A heavy, electric shockwave ripped through the room. Grizzly froze. Big Joe dropped his rag. "Dutch Henderson," Iron Bill repeated, the name spoken with absolute reverence. He turned slowly towards Silas. David Dutch Henderson was the master mechanic for the original Oakland charter in 1968. He was a founding father of our club. In 1978, during a massive highway ambush, Dutch laid his own bike down to shield my father, the former president. Dutch took 3 bullets, survived, and walked away from the life to raise his baby girl, this boy's mother. Iron Bill stepped toward Silas, his presence suffocating. "We looked for Dutch's family for decades to repay that blood debt. You didn't just walk into a shop to steal a runaway paycheck. You walked into a fortress of the Hells Angels to kidnap club royalty." Silas looked at Trent, desperately pleading for help. "I ain't dying for your payout," Trent choked out, his hand still raised. He backed slowly out the door, turned, and sprinted away, abandoning Silas completely. Iron Bill crouched down next to Silas. "You have 5 seconds to disappear. If you ever look for this boy again, we won't involve the police. We will simply erase you. Run." Silas scrambled to his feet, slipping on a patch of oil, and bolted out of the bay doors, leaving his truck, his forged papers, and his dignity behind. He would never be seen in California again. 3 weeks later, the shop doors were thrown wide open. The parking lot was packed with legendary riders from across the country, assembled not for club business, but to celebrate Caleb's 18th birthday. In the center of the lot sat the 1990 Sportster, flawlessly rebuilt and gleaming. Caleb stood beside it, wiping his clean hands on his jeans. Grizzly approached, holding out a custom-tooled leather vest. It didn't bear the club's patches. Caleb was free to live his own life, but over the heart it featured a solitary, intricate patch, a winged piston with the initials DH. Caleb looked around at the men who had become his family. He wasn't astray anymore. He smiled, threw his leg over the saddle, and fired up the engine, ready to ride into a future he finally owned. Caleb's journey from a terrified, starving runaway to a master mechanic surrounded by fiercely loyal brothers proves that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's forged in grease, fire, and chrome. The Hells Angels didn't just fix a broken teenager's life, they unwittingly brought a piece of their own history back home. Today, Caleb stands tall, turning wrenches with a heavy, undeniable backing of 300 guardian angels.